Beneath the endless swell of the Atlantic, between shifting winds and currents that guided the age of empires, lie islands that history almost forgot. Before the maps of the New World were inked with names we now recognize, there were scattered outposts, hidden by fog and distance, stepping stones between two unknown worlds. These were the secret islands of the 16th century, discovered, charted, and sometimes lost again to the sea, before the full shape of America was even known. The dawn of the 1500s was an age of wind and wood, when the horizon was both promise and peril. The Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, had become the twin beacons of maritime exploration. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, had drawn an invisible line across the world, dividing newly discovered lands between these two powers. Yet beyond the line, beyond the known Atlantic, islands flickered in the mist, places whispered of by sailors and hinted at by currents and flocks of birds far from shore. In the early years of the 16th century, explorers sought not only continents but havens. The Atlantic islands, the Azores, Madeira, and the Canaries had become critical supply points, but farther west, rumors persisted. Fishermen from the Basque Country and Brittany spoke of rich waters filled with cod, somewhere beyond the horizon, perhaps around islands near Newfoundland or the coasts of what would later be called New England. The Portuguese, too, whispered of mysterious lands sighted west of the Azores, fleeting glimpses of green hills rising from the sea, which they called Ilhas Desconhecidas, the unknown islands. These whispers drove cartographers to ink uncertain shapes on maps. Phantom islands such as Antilia, Buss Island, or the Isle of St. Brendan. Some were based on sailors' tales, others on misread bearings. But amid these myths, real discoveries took place. Islands that were not imagined but tangible, serving as the first contact points with the American continent. By 1500, the Atlantic had become a highway of exploration. The Portuguese navigator Gaspar Corte Real sailed westward from the Azores, seeking new lands under his king's commission. He reached the icy coasts of what we now know as Newfoundland and Labrador. There, he found an abundance of timber and strange peoples whom he described in his reports. Some of his men vanished. Others returned with captives, who were shown at the Portuguese court as proof of discovery. Yet when Corte Real set sail again in 1501, he was never seen again. His ships disappeared among the mists, leaving only his name on early maps and a legacy of unanswered questions. While Portugal probed the northern Atlantic, Spain's gaze turned south and west. In 1502, Columbus made his final voyage, still convinced he was skirting the edges of Asia. He explored the coasts of Central America, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, seeking a strait to the Indies. Though he found none, his reports confirmed the presence of countless islands and shorelines unknown to Europe. Each was a fragment of a greater world taking shape, piece by piece, in the European imagination. Yet even as the major powers mapped coasts and capes, smaller nations began to explore in secret. The English, under John Cabot, had already touched North American shores in 1497. In the decades that followed, independent mariners, English, French, and even Scandinavian, ventured quietly into the western seas, seeking fisheries and unclaimed islands. The North Atlantic, once an empty void on medieval charts, now teemed with ships following the migration of cod, whales, and the promise of trade. Among these remote outposts were the islands of Newfoundland and Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, where seasonal camps appeared. These were among the first European footholds in the New World, not colonies but places of labor, salt, and fish. Over time, they became secret anchorages where ships repaired their hulls, salted their catches, and gathered news before returning across the ocean. These rugged shores, cold and treeless, were the unheralded beginnings of the Atlantic world. Farther south, in the Caribbean, Another network of secret islands emerged, not from secrecy by intent, but from the obscurity of discovery. When Columbus first sailed among them, he encountered hundreds of islands scattered like jewels across a turquoise sea. Some would become famous: Hispaniola, Cuba, Puerto Rico, but others remained uncharted, hidden behind reefs and shoals. For decades, maps of the Caribbean were works in progress, their coastlines shifting with each new voyage. Sailors spoke of islands that appeared and disappeared with the mist, often real, but misplaced. One such island was Guanaja, off the coast of present-day Honduras, where Columbus first met the great dugout canoes of the Maya traders, a silent encounter between two maritime worlds. To the Spanish, these islands were not destinations but waypoints, stepping stones on the path to empire. Yet for the indigenous peoples who inhabited them, they were homelands, sacred spaces in a sea that connected rather than divided. As the 16th century advanced, secrecy became strategy. The Spanish crown guarded the locations of its new islands and ports with obsessive secrecy. Maps were declared state secrets, their contents known only to royal cartographers. The Casa de la Contratación, established in Seville in 1503, controlled every chart, every report from the New World. To publish or copy a map without permission was a crime of treason. Thus, the geography of America and its many hidden islands became a guarded mystery. While Spain sealed its discoveries, others sought to unlock them. The French sent expeditions to the Caribbean, where they encountered islands unknown to earlier Spanish maps: Dominica, Guadeloupe, Martinique. To these sailors, the islands seemed untouched, yet their volcanic peaks and fertile soils had long been inhabited by the Kalinago, whom Europeans called Caribs. Conflict soon followed, as each new island became a contested frontier between native resistance and European ambition. By the 1520s, the Caribbean archipelago had become the stage for imperial rivalry. The Spanish fortified key islands, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, turning them into naval bastions, but scattered beyond them lay hundreds of small, unnamed islets, places of refuge for shipwrecked sailors, runaway slaves, and pirates. These were the secret islands in a truer sense, hidden not from maps, but from power, places where history's margins endured. The story of these islands is a map of human encounter, of trade and violence, discovery and loss. Each was a crossroads between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And as the 16th century unfolded, they became the crucible where the old world and new collided. Beyond the Caribbean, new discoveries continued along the South American coast. Portuguese mariners, following the current known as the Brazil Current, charted islands like Fernando de Noronha, discovered around 1503. Its cliffs rose like fortress walls from the sea, marking the farthest Atlantic reach of Portuguese Brazil. For a time, it served as a secret anchorage for passing ships, a silent witness to the age of discovery's expansion. Meanwhile, in the northern reaches of the Pacific, though rarely recorded in European texts, indigenous peoples of the Aleutian Islands and Alaska maintained vast maritime networks. Their existence would remain unknown to Europeans until much later, but they were part of a living geography that connected the Americas long before colonization. By mid-century, the map of the Atlantic world had changed forever. The once empty ocean was now dotted with islands that linked continents and empires. Yet for every known shore, there remained others unmarked: reefs, sandbanks, and lonely volcanic peaks that emerged briefly in the age's chronicles, then vanished again beneath the waves of time. It was an era defined not only by discovery, but by forgetting, the erasure of lands, names, and peoples from memory. The islands that remained on maps were those that served empire. The others drifted into obscurity. Still, the sea kept its memory. Beneath its surface lay shipwrecks and anchors scattered across forgotten routes. On islands like the Turks and Caicos, fragments of Spanish pottery still lie buried beneath coral sand. The remnants of a voyage, a storm, a story untold. And so, as the 16th century entered its height, the secret islands of the Americas were both real and metaphorical, thresholds between worlds, where history was born in silence, wind, and salt. By the mid-16th century, the New World was no longer an empty outline on Europe's maps. Coastlines had names, and islands were counted like treasures, yet many still lay beyond the reach of empire. Scattered, secret, or simply forgotten. The sea remained vast and unknowable, and in its vastness, the most unlikely of places became the foundation stones of power. In the Caribbean, Spanish galleons now crisscrossed from port to port, carrying silver, sugar, and news of empire. But among the major islands lay countless others, each with its own role in the growing web of exploration and conquest. The Windward Islands, from Guadeloupe to Barbados, were still thick with jungle and guarded by the Caribs. Their canoes cut silently through turquoise channels, and their settlements clung to forested slopes untouched by the European hand. To the north, the Bahamas shimmered like pearls, their shallow banks treacherous to heavy ships. Many Spanish vessels wrecked there on their way home from the Indies, scattering their riches and bones alike across the reefs. One such island, Guanahani, known to the Spanish as San Salvador, had been Columbus's first landfall. By 1550, it had faded into near obscurity. The exact island was already uncertain, and historians would debate its identity for centuries. This was the fate of many islands in the 16th century, discovered, renamed, and misplaced as maps were copied and corrupted. Each cartographer redrew the world slightly differently, until the sea itself became a puzzle of truth and error. Beyond the Caribbean, another network of secret islands took shape along the Pacific side of the Americas. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and beheld a vast ocean that no European had seen before. 6 years later, Ferdinand Magellan would sail that ocean, charting its first known islands, Guam and the Marianas, before his fleet reached the Philippines. But closer to the American coast, countless smaller islands remained hidden. Volcanic outcrops, coral atolls, and rocky havens known only to local sailors. The first European to explore these Pacific coasts in detail was Francisco de Ulloa, sent by Hernán Cortés in 1539. Sailing north along the coast of Mexico, Ulloa charted the Gulf of California, believing he might find a strait linking the Pacific to the Atlantic. His reports described barren islands scattered across the Gulf, Tiburon, Ángel de la Guarda, and others. Some were uninhabited, others home to small fishing communities of the Seri and Yaqui peoples. These islands would become, in time, stepping stones for Spanish expansion northward. Further south, near the coast of Peru and Ecuador, mariners encountered another mysterious archipelago, the Galapagos Islands. Discovered in 1535 by Fray Thomas de Berlanga, Bishop of Panama, they were a chance discovery. His ship, driven off course by currents, came upon these desolate volcanic islands rising from the Pacific. He described them as barren and lifeless, with giant tortoises and birds that could not fly. The Galapagos would remain largely forgotten for centuries, known only to passing sailors and pirates who used them as secret refuges. But they were a living museum, a silent archive of nature untouched by time. Meanwhile, the Portuguese continued their expansion along the South Atlantic. Their domain stretched from the Azores to Brazil, and in between lay several secret havens known only to mariners. Ascension Island, discovered in 1501, St. Helena in 1502, and the distant Tristan da Cunha, sighted around 1506. These islands served as waypoints for fleets traveling between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Isolated and barren, they were nonetheless lifelines, places to take water, repair ships, or bury the dead. But secrecy was as much a weapon as discovery. The Spanish and Portuguese both guarded their routes with silence. Their maps, hand-drawn and locked within royal archives, rarely circulated. Even the position of known islands was sometimes intentionally falsified to mislead rivals. English and French captains who ventured west in search of new lands often found themselves chasing phantoms, islands drawn in the wrong place, or never real to begin with. Among these legendary islands was the Isle of the Seven Cities, or Antilia, a myth carried from medieval Portuguese maps. It was said to lie somewhere between the Azores and the Americas, settled by Christian refugees who fled the Moors centuries before. Sailors of the 16th century still searched for it, believing it might hold riches or allies. Another was Buss Island, charted by English mariners near the Davis Strait, which would haunt maps until the 18th century. In truth, these were errors, mirages of exploration's uncertain age, but they reveal the powerful blend of faith and geography that drove men into the unknown. Even genuine islands could become lost. The tiny island of Bermeja, once shown on maps off the Yucatan coast, vanished completely from later records. Whether it sank beneath the sea or was simply a cartographer's mistake remains unsolved. Such disappearances remind us that even in the age of discovery, the Earth's geography was a living mystery, not yet fixed or fully known. As the 1500s progressed, the Caribbean grew crowded with ambition. The Spanish monopoly was challenged by new powers, the French, English, and Dutch. Unable to confront Spain directly, they sought the hidden spaces, unguarded bays, unclaimed islands, and remote anchorages from which to raid Spanish shipping. Thus began the secret history of the Caribbean's pirate isles. In 1555, French privateers under François Leclerc, known as Jambes de Bois, the wooden leg, attacked Santiago in Cuba, then vanished into the maze of islands. He and his men used the small cays of the Bahamas and the Virgin Islands as their hideouts, invisible to Spain's armadas. By the late 1500s, English mariners like John Hawkins and Francis Drake adopted the same strategy. They would strike swiftly, refit on uninhabited islands, and disappear again. These small islands, once mere dots on maps, became the shadow ports of a new maritime age. Isla de Pinos off Cuba, the cays of the Bahamas, the islets of Tortuga and Providence. Each would, in time, gain infamy as havens of pirates, smugglers, and rebels against empire. Yet in the 16th century, they were simply outposts of survival, secret places where the human story met the raw geography of the sea. Not all island stories were born of violence. Along the Pacific coast, the Spanish continued to explore northward from Mexico. In 1542, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo sailed into the bays of what is now California, mapping its coast and recording several offshore islands, the Channel Islands, which the Chumash people had inhabited for millennia. Cabrillo noted their canoes, their villages, and their trade with the mainland. These islands would later serve as markers for future expeditions, but in Cabrillo's time, they were still worlds unto themselves, rich with culture and history unseen by Europe. While Cabrillo charted the northern Pacific, Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa explored the southern reaches. In the 1580s, he led expeditions through the Strait of Magellan, documenting the countless islands that formed its labyrinthine passage. He gave names to many: Desolacion, Magdalena, Isabel. But the strait's fury soon scattered his fleet. The islands, battered by wind and cold, were among the most remote in the world. Yet even there, small communities of the Kaweskar people thrived, navigating in bark canoes between channels that Europeans barely survived. As the century neared its end, Another mystery began to stir: the idea of a great southern continent. Reports from sailors who had drifted far south spoke of land beyond Tierra del Fuego, perhaps another island, perhaps a new world. These whispers would feed the dreams of future explorers, though in the 16th century, they remained little more than conjecture. Across the Atlantic, in the north, English sailors continued to probe the icy fringes of the New World. Martin Frobisher, in the 1570s, explored the coasts of Baffin Island and Greenland, seeking a northwest passage. He returned with tales of strange rocks and glacial islands, and of a land glittering with what he thought was gold. Though the mineral proved worthless, his voyages revealed new lands, the Arctic islands that formed the edge of North America. These frozen realms, desolate and forbidding, were also among the secret islands of the age, discovered but largely unvisited for centuries. The map of the Americas by 1600 was therefore not just a chart of known lands, but a patchwork of mysteries. Some islands had vanished, others had just been found, and many more remained hidden behind myth and misdirection. The sea was still a veil, and behind it the world continued to reveal itself, piece by piece, voyage by voyage. But beyond all discovery lay something deeper: the silent transformation of humanity's relationship with the planet. For the first time in history, every ocean had become a road. The hidden islands of the 16th century were not merely places on a map. They were symbols of this awakening, the moment when the Earth itself ceased to be infinite and began to take form. By the last decades of the 16th century, the age of discovery was drawing to its close, but its echoes still rippled across the oceans. What began with bold ventures into the unknown had become a global web of empire, commerce, and knowledge. Yet scattered through this vast new world were places that remained elusive, islands that had appeared and disappeared from the record, fragments of geography left behind by history's tides. These were the last of America's secret islands, discovered, charted, forgotten, and rediscovered again. The century that had begun with Columbus ended with Drake. Between them stretched 100 years of wind and conquest, of explorers who followed stars and shadows into uncharted seas. As the Spanish Empire tightened its hold on the Caribbean and Pacific, the English, Dutch, and French turned to the spaces Spain could not defend: the hidden coasts and unnamed islands that still lay beyond the reach of power. The ocean itself became a theater of shadows, where discovery was a weapon and secrecy a shield. Francis Drake's circumnavigation in 1577 was a voyage that redefined the world's horizon. Sailing through the Strait of Magellan, his small fleet entered the Pacific, a realm then known only to the Spanish. Storms scattered his ships, and for weeks Drake struggled among the islands of southern Chile. He described wild landscapes of mist and snow, channels filled with ice, and islands without number. Among them, he discovered one safe harbor, later named Elizabeth Island, whose exact location was soon lost again. For centuries, mapmakers searched for it in vain. Drake continued northward, charting the coasts of modern-day Chile, Peru, and California. Along the way, he noted countless small islands, some rising from the fog like phantoms, others rich with birds and seals. When he finally landed in what is now California's Marin County, he claimed it as Nova Albion for England. Offshore lay the Farallon Islands, which he recorded only as distant rocks, barren and white with seabirds. These islands, lonely sentinels off the Pacific coast, would later become symbols of exploration's reach and its limits. Always visible, yet eternally isolated across the Caribbean, the late 1500s brought a different kind of discovery. The age of conquest had given way to an age of survival. Spanish settlements struggled against storms, disease, and the growing menace of piracy. The smaller islands, once ignored, became critical sanctuaries, On Isla de Margarita, pearls shimmered in the shallows. On Curaçao and Bonaire, the Dutch established hidden salt pans to supply their fleets. Further north, in the Bahamas, English sailors began to settle the smaller cays, carving out fragile communities of outlaws and traders. These islands were not grand discoveries, but quiet ones, the kind of places where history whispered rather than shouted. Even more remote were the islands of the Pacific, still largely unknown to Europe. The voyages of Álvaro de Mendaña, sailing from Peru in 1567, marked the next frontier. He sought the fabled Islands of Solomon, rumored to be rich in gold. His expedition crossed the vast Pacific and reached the Solomons after months at sea, encountering lush volcanic islands inhabited by Melanesian peoples. Mendaña claimed them for Spain, but his records were vague, and when later explorers tried to find them again, they failed. The Solomon Islands, though real, became for decades another mystery of the sea, lost in translation between charts and memory. Mendaña's second voyage in 1595 took him eastward again. He discovered the Marquesas Islands, towering green spires in the middle of an endless ocean. His men named them after Spanish nobles, but their beauty and isolation left a stronger impression. For weeks they lingered, trading with local people whose culture was rich and intricate, shaped by centuries of voyaging across the Pacific. These encounters revealed to Europeans a truth they had scarcely imagined, that the ocean they called empty was in fact alive with navigation, knowledge, and civilization. When Mendaña died on that voyage, his dream of a Pacific empire perished with him. His ships drifted on, eventually reaching the Santa Cruz Islands, where disease and conflict ended the expedition. The Pacific, vast beyond comprehension, had swallowed yet another fleet. Back in the Atlantic, a quieter transformation unfolded. The secret islands that had once served as waypoints now became territories of trade and colonization. The Azores became a hub for transatlantic crossings. Madeira and the Canary Islands grew rich from sugar. The smaller, more remote outposts, Ascension, St. Helena, Fernando de Noronha, remained silent way stations, their only inhabitants the wind and seabirds. Each held the ghosts of countless ships that had paused there briefly, leaving behind carvings, graves, or the iron of an anchor rusting into the sand. As the century waned, maps of the New World reached a new level of accuracy. The work of cartographers such as Gerardus Mercator and Abraham Ortelius brought order to the chaos of earlier charts. But even the finest maps still contained mysteries. Small, nameless dots scattered across the margins, hints of islands that no one could confirm. These were the remnants of the 16th century's imagination, records of sightings, legends, and hopes that had once driven men to sea. Among them was High Brazil, a phantom island said to lie west of Ireland, appearing only once every 7 years. Though never part of the Americas, its legend persisted into the age of transatlantic exploration, merging myth with the cartographic urge to fill every empty space. Others, like the Isle of Maida or Satanazes, drifted from medieval charts into early modern atlases, ghosts of a geography that could not yet admit blankness. By 1600, the age of the secret islands was ending. The oceans had been crossed, the continents outlined, the major archipelagos claimed. What remained were the margins, the hidden coves, the unnamed cays, the forgotten rocks. Yet in those margins lay the spirit that had defined the 16th century. The hunger to know, to chart, to understand the shape of the world. Still, even as the great powers consolidated their empires, new secrets began to emerge, not of geography, but of humanity. The islands became laboratories of encounter, where European, African, and indigenous peoples met and mingled. Out of these meetings arose new languages, new beliefs, new worlds. On the shores of Hispaniola, In the plantations of São Tomé, in the fishing camps of Newfoundland, the human map began to shift as profoundly as the geographic one. The secret islands of America were no longer just places. They were ideas, symbols of transition between discovery and understanding. They marked the edges of exploration, where certainty ended and mystery began. And even as empire grew, the ocean kept its silences. Off the coast of Florida, the reefs of the Keys claimed galleons by the dozen. Along the Yucatan, the island of Cozumel, once sacred to the Maya goddess Ixchel, became a ruin overtaken by jungle. In the Bay of Honduras, Roatan and Utila became havens for castaways and exiles. These were not the grand discoveries of kings and captains, but the small, enduring truths of geography, that every map, however complete, leaves something uncharted. As the 16th century gave way to the 17th, a new generation of explorers prepared to set sail. They would push farther, north to the Arctic, south to the Antarctic, west across the Pacific. But they inherited the world the 16th century had revealed. The islands they sought were no longer secret, yet the spirit of discovery remained the same. The endless curiosity that had carried men from Lisbon and Seville, Bristol and Rouen, across the world's widest waters. In the fading light of that century, the Atlantic and Pacific had become mirrors of humanity's ambition. Each island, however small, was a reflection of our need to know what lies beyond the horizon. Some of those islands endure today as nations. Others have vanished beneath the waves. But all share the same origin, the restless urge that drove wooden ships into the unknown. And so, the story of America's secret islands is not merely about geography. It is about the human spirit itself, about the hunger for knowledge, the courage to face the void, and the quiet realization that discovery never truly ends. For every land we find, another mystery appears just beyond sight. Across the centuries, the winds still carry that same echo. The creak of masts, the flutter of sails, the sound of distant surf against an unseen shore. Somewhere, beyond the last horizon, another island waits, not hidden by distance, but by time. The maps have changed, the empires have faded, but the sea remains the same, vast, eternal, and filled with secrets.